The brood will take you beyond fear, beyond terror, beyond the boundaries of the mind, and will devastate you totally. More frightening than the unknown is something you know you can't control. Inside some of us, it's hiding, screaming to get out. If it's ever unleashed, it will destroy anything that gets in its way. The Brood. David Cronenberg's The Brood. The Ultimate Experience in Inner Terror. A novel by Richard Starks. Narrated by Jon Olsen. Inside some of us, it's hiding, screaming to get out. Dr. Hal Raglan, The Shape of Rage. Psychoplasmics. It was the new wonder science, if that wasn't too fine a word for it, that was supposed to go beyond the conventional limits of modern psychiatry, reaching deep into the mind, into the body, digging and poking into the darkest corners. Maybe it really did achieve the miraculous results that its proponents claimed for it. And maybe it did enable the mind and the body to break free of their inhibitions. But to Carveth, it was still unproven. Operating on the borders of human knowledge. That was how Nola's former psychiatrist had described it. But that was just another way of saying that it was a novelty that no one properly understood. Still, an open mind. He had promised himself he would give it that much of a chance at least. View the demonstration, then make a judgment. If Nola could benefit, and if psychoplasmics could help them get together again, then that in itself would make it all worthwhile. When Juliana returned to the living room, she found Candy sitting cross-legged on the floor with an array of old photographs spread out in front of her like a fan. Juliana peered over her shoulder. For her, the photographs brought back a flood of memories. All was the good times, she thought. It was funny how the camera could be so one-sided, never recording the bad times. The image of her life as portrayed by the pictures was one of constant enjoyment, a continuous round of summer trips and holidays, of Christmases and family gatherings, old cars, and the first house she had bought with Barton. Too bad the mind couldn't be so selective, ignoring the underside and recalling only the moments of joy. Not that her marriage to Barton hadn't worked at the beginning. It was just that, like so many others, it had gradually gone sour as time had eroded the initial euphoria, leaving bare the reality and the unpleasant truth that both of them had made a mistake. She couldn't really blame Barton for that. True, she had found him insensitive, too often wrapped up in a world of his own. He'd been emotionally selfish, generous enough materially, but miserly with his affection and time. She had wanted to lean on him, to draw strength from him, but he had failed to provide the support that she had needed. In her heart, though, she knew that the fault had been hers as much as his. She had demanded too much of him, or at least, she had demanded more than he was capable of giving. So who was to blame for that? She had tried to hold on to him as long as she could, but when Nola had been born, it had seemed that Barton had pulled even further away from the marriage. He'd stayed late at the office, only coming home after Nola had been washed and tucked into bed. And gradually Juliana had found that the more time she was forced to spend with her daughter, the less she was able to spend with Barton. Rather than a common bond that might bring them together, Nola had been a wedge that had driven them further apart. And Juliana had come to resent her, resent the demands she made, and the way she was pushing Barton away. She shook her head at the memory, and refilled her glass, then joined Candy on the floor, sitting unconsciously in the same cross-legged position. Suddenly she looked up. From the kitchen she'd heard a muffled sound, like a footfall that had been deliberately disguised. She listened for a moment, but the sound wasn't repeated. Candy was hunting through the cardboard box, picking out more of the photographs and laying them out like cards. "Who's this?" she asked. She held out one of the pictures, and Juliana took it. "It's another picture of Nola," she said. "Your mommy when she was a little girl. What's she doing wrapped up in those funny clothes?" Juliana's smile was bleak. "They're not clothes," she said. "They're bandages. Your mommy was in hospital for a time, when she was young, about your age." Candy looked up at her. "Why?" she asked. "Was Mommy sick?" "You know what was wrong with her, don't you? You've asked me before." "I think I forgot." Juliana pulled out another photograph and showed it to Candy. "Here, have a look at this one. See if you can pick out your Mommy." "I want to hear about Mommy in the hospital, about why she was there." Juliana looked down at her drink. "Not now, honey," she said. "Was she being punished?" Juliana turned quickly towards her. "Why do you say that?" "I don't know. I thought maybe she'd been naughty and had to go to the hospital." "People don't go to the hospital to be punished. They go there if they're sick, to get well." "Will I have to go?" "Of course not. Not unless you get sick, like your Mommy. But there's nothing wrong with you, is there? You're perfectly normal." She stopped. A plate in the kitchen had fallen to the floor. "I guess I didn't stack the dishes too well." She stood up. "I'd better go take a look." She walked down the hall to the kitchen. As she entered it, she felt a blast of cold air on her feet. She looked down. The milk chute doors, both inner and outer, were open. She knelt on the floor to close the outer one, but something seemed to be blocking it. With an effort, she pulled the door free and managed to close it. But then she noticed that the inside bolts that normally secured it had both been torn loose, ripped right out of the wood, and the inner door, too, had been wrenched from its hinges. She pulled a chair in front of the chute in an attempt to seal it. On the floor behind her, a dinner plate was in pieces, on the floor. She bent to clean it up. And as she did so, a movement on top of the refrigerator caught her eye. She looked up. The refrigerator was set back against the wall, half hidden at the end of a row of overhead cupboards. She stood up straight and moved carefully around it. Something was up there. She could hear breathing, a soft whispering sound. She glanced quickly at the door, measuring her distance from it, then took a step towards it. Suddenly she froze. A hand came around the corner of the cupboard at the top of the fridge. The fingers were webbed, not fully formed. They gripped the side of the cupboard. Juliana stared at them, then took a step back, edging away until she was pressed against the table. Slowly she began moving to the door. She was almost there, ready to run from the room, when the hand moved down, seeking a better grip. Then suddenly a face came into view. Juliana stared at it in horror. For a moment she was unable to move, could not react. Then she opened her mouth in a piercing scream that was suddenly cut off as the creature on top of the fridge hurled itself at her, landing with all its weight on her chest. When Candy heard the scream, she rose silently to her feet and moved, as if in a trance, down the hall to the kitchen. The door was open. She looked in. The body of her grandmother was lying in the corner, crumpled, broken. Candy walked towards it, looking down impassively. She was still clutching the photograph of Nola and her grandmother in the hospital, and slowly she twisted it in her hands until it was rolled into a tight ball, then dropped it on the floor by her grandmother's side. It bounced once, then rolled, coming to a stop by Juliana's outstretched fingers, so that it seemed as if she'd been reaching for it, trying to grasp it, but had been unable to get her hand on it. Inside the school, Candy tried to reach for her jacket. Two kids, already dressed in their coats, English-style duffel coats with their hoods pulled over their heads, were blocking her way. Candy pushed between them, and they moved aside, watching as she struggled into her jacket, zipping it up the front. They shifted position then to stand behind her, pinioning her against the wall. She tried to fight her way past them, but the kids wouldn't move. She struggled between them, trying to squirm through, but one of them pushed her roughly against the wall. She looked up in shock. Then they turned, and she looked into their faces, under their hoods. She froze. The two kids took up position beside her. Neither of them touched her, but they started to walk away from the coat racks, away from the crush, and Candy walked between them, moving through the throng of other kids who stepped out of their way, falling silent as they stared into their soft, formless faces. The child creatures marched in step, Candy moving between them. They went down the corridor, away from the front entrance of the school, towards the classrooms. The door of Candy's classroom was open. The creatures stopped outside. Through the door, Candy could see Ruth Mayer at the blackboard, writing up the next day's lessons. A number of her classmates were tidying up at the rear of the room, putting crayons into boxes, and washing paint from their hands at a sink in the corner. Candy moved forward, the creatures either side of her. She stopped at the first row of desks, but the child creatures continued to the front of the class, to the blackboard where Ruth was working. From the play area, one of them picked up a wooden hammer used to pound pegs into holes. The other chose a pair of blunt-ended scissors. Candy watched them in silence. Ruth heard a sound behind her and glanced quickly over her shoulder. "Hello, you two. Forget something, did you?" She continued writing, rubbing the board clean ahead of her. When the first of the creatures attacked her, stabbing at her with the blunted scissors, it was surprise that showed first on her face. Surprise at the viciousness of the attack and the strength with which it was delivered. But as she slumped to the floor and the second creature brought the flat of the hammer down on the side of her head, it was pain that clouded her eyes. The children watched, some whimpering, some crying, some too stunned to react. The creatures increased the fury of their attack, beating and stabbing at Ruth as she lay helpless on the floor. Then suddenly the attack was over. The two creatures stood and walked towards Candy. They stopped on either side of her, then moved slowly towards the door. Candy turned and kept pace with them, walking between them. A boy ran from the room, down the corridor, past the group of kids still by the coat racks, and outside into the yard, yelling at the top of his voice, "They've hurt Miss Mayer! They've hurt Miss Mayer!" Carveth grabbed him, holding him by the shoulders. "What's the matter? What's happening in there?" "It's Miss Mayer," the boy said. His eyes were squeezed shut. "The bad kids hurt her. They made her fall down." Carveth pushed his way into the school, sprinted down the corridor and into the classroom. Ruth was lying beside the raised platform at the front of the class, one arm draped over the edge. Carveth tried to turn her over, moving her head gently, but it rolled under its own weight, turning much too easily. He searched for a pulse in her neck. Ruth's eyes stared up at him. He brushed her hair away from her face, then laid her head on the floor. For a moment he was unable to move. Then he turned. The room behind him had filled with parents, kids, teachers who had followed him into the room. "Candy?" He stood up. "Candy!" His voice rose, urgent. One of the teachers knelt beside Ruth, then covered her face with a sheet of paper. Carveth went into the hallway, his eyes searching the faces of the silent children. Candy was gone. Nola was sitting cross-legged on the couch, eyes shut, rocking gently backwards and forwards on her heels. She did not look around as Carveth closed the door behind him. "Hal, is that you?" Carveth took a couple of steps into the room. Nola seemed different, changed, and for a moment he was unable to pinpoint the reason. But then he realized it was Nola's expression, her demeanor. She no longer looked pained, troubled by some inner conflict. Instead, for the first time as long as Carveth could remember, she seemed strong, in total control. "It's me, Nola," he said. "It's Frank." Nola turned slowly towards him. She was wearing a long white gown like a tent dress, but as she turned he could see that it was slit up the front like a robe. "Frank, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you, see how you were." "I'm in isolation, Frank. You shouldn't be here." He shrugged, deliberately offhand. "I came anyway. We've been apart too long, and I want us to be a family again, like before." Nola smiled at him. "That's nice, Frank. I knew you would come." Raglan balanced his gun in his hand as if trying to gauge its weight. He wasn't sure how much protection it would provide, but at least the feel of it gave him a measure of confidence. He waited a moment or two to give Carveth time to divert Nola's attention. Then slowly he began climbing the stairs to the attic. Nola's smile had vanished. "I don't see how you expect me to believe that you want us to be a family again. Not when I know you're involved with another woman." Carveth spoke softly, his voice reassuring. "Nola, there's no other woman. No one else in my life except you. That won't change, and you know it." "I wish it were true. God, I really wish it were true." "We've lost touch, Nola, that's all. But we can be a family again, the three of us." "Not if you try to take Candy." Nola's voice was sharp. "Not if you try to take her away from me." "I would never do that. Candy's your daughter, too. A part of our family." Nola turned away and was silent for a moment. "It may be too late," she said finally. "Strange things have been happening to me. Too strange for me to share with anyone from my old life." "Then make me a part of your new life. Show me. Involve me. I want to be a part of it, Nola. I'm ready now. I wasn't before, but I am now." Raglan stood at the top of the stairs and listened. There was no sound from the attic, no hint that anything was in there. He pushed open the door. It was dark inside. He felt for the light switch on the wall beside him and flicked it on. A storeroom was on his right. He glanced into it. Empty. Then he moved forward into the room beyond. The attic had never been properly finished, but 2 rows of bunks had been constructed along the side walls. Raglan ducked under a beam in the ceiling, and as he straightened he saw the child creatures resting on the bunks, some propped up on their elbows or leaning on the bedposts, others sitting with their backs against the walls. He could hear breathing all around him. The creatures watched him, following his progress. There was no emotion in their faces, but he could sense a latent hostility, see it in their eyes. They stirred restlessly as he moved from bunk to bunk, searching for Candy. He caught a sudden movement out of the corner of his eye and realized there were more of them at the far end of the attic. He hesitated a moment, then forced himself to go on. Candy was lying on a lower bunk by the window. 2 of the creatures watched over her, one sitting at the head of the bunk, the other curled beside her. Raglan shifted his gun to his other hand and gently shook Candy's shoulder. Behind him he heard some of the other creatures stirring from their bunks and jumping to the floor. "Candy." Raglan's voice was little more than a whisper. "Candy, wake up." She shrank away from his touch, then suddenly sat up, blinking sleep from her eyes. "Daddy?" "It's Dr. Hal, Candy. Your daddy's downstairs. He wants to see you. Come on. He's waiting for you." He put his arm around her and lifted her from the bunk, holding her close to his chest. The 2 creatures beside her rose to their feet. Slowly, Raglan began to move to the door. Nola's face showed her disbelief. "I don't think you want us to be together again, Frank. I think you hate me, despise me." "Nola, I want to be with you. Wherever your new life takes you, I want to be there too." "Do you, Frank? Do you?" She stared at him with a fierce intensity. "You wouldn't understand me. Not any more. I've changed too much." "You're still my wife, Nola." She watched him carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. "Then look, Frank," she said. "Look at me now." With a wide sweep of her arms she lifted the sides of her robe, holding them out like the wings of a cape. "Look. This is me. This is me inside." "Oh, God, Nola, no!" Nola's body under her robe was naked, but her skin, no longer pale and smooth, was covered with angry swellings, crisscrossed with dark, venous lines. The largest was an amniotic sac, the skin so distended it was almost transparent. A small, blood-red cord was all that joined it to her body. Carveth stared at it. What horrified him was not just its size, but the shape he could see in the serous fluid inside. Ill-formed limbs, undifferentiated, but nonetheless clearly recognizable as those of a developing fetus. Nola gently lifted the sack, feeling its shape with her hands. Then suddenly it ruptured, the serous fluid spilling into her lap, and as Carveth watched in horrid fascination, she leaned forward to pull at the sack, tearing away the skin, exposing a live, struggling child of her rage, which she held wrapped in the folds of her robe. Carveth shrank from her, involuntarily moving away. "This is me, Frank. This is me." She looked up, studying his face, and slowly her expression changed. The defiance, the challenge with which she had revealed herself gradually gave way to anger. "I disgust you, don't I, Frank?" she said. "I sicken you. You didn't come here because you love me. You came to take my daughter. You came to betray me." In the attic, Raglan heard Nola shout and realized he had lost. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The faces of the child creatures were no longer impassive. Now they were swollen with rage. He set Candy down on the floor. "Quickly," he said. "Quickly." He pushed her forward towards the door. A hand suddenly reached out from one of the bunks, and one of the creatures raked its nails across his face. He turned and fired point blank, instantly killing it. Another grabbed at his leg. He kicked out, and the grip was momentarily relaxed. But then another held him. He couldn't shake them off, couldn't make them let go. He dragged himself forward, pulling the weight of them with him. Then suddenly the rest of the creatures attacked him, coming at him from all directions, punching, kicking, biting, and scratching, trying to bring him down. In the tight space between the bunks he was unable to maneuver. He couldn't turn round to face them, couldn't strike out. He fired again, blindly, hitting 2 more of the creatures. But there were too many of them now, jumping on his back, tugging at his hair, and throwing him off balance. He lunged then, hurling his weight forward as far as he could, trying to get to the door. But they held him back, grappling at his legs, his ankles, pulling him down and sending him sprawling full length on the floor. Candy was in the doorway. She turned as Raglan fell, as the brood swarmed over him, beating him with their fists, attacking him in a frenzy of anger. She saw him rise once, forcing his way to his feet, groping desperately for support from one of the bunk posts. He managed to take 1 step forward towards the door, but the creatures held on to him, renewing their attack, climbing onto the bunks and jumping on him, pulling him down, punching, biting, kicking, until finally he sank back to the floor, buried under the weight of their uncontrollable rage. As Nola began to shout, Carveth tried desperately to calm her, but she was beyond control, beyond all reason. He gripped her tightly by the shoulders. "Nola, listen to me. I came here to help you, not to betray you." "No, you're lying. I know you are. I know you too well. You came to take Candy, but it won't work. I'd kill her before I'd let you take her away from me. Do you hear? I'd kill her." Candy held her hands over her ears, trying to blank out the sound of Raglan's attackers. Then suddenly the onslaught stopped. The brood turned and looked at her, and slowly, one by one, they rose to their feet and moved towards her. Candy backed away, feeling for the doorway behind her. She had reached the storeroom door when the brood broke into a run, coming for her, reaching for her, their faces bloated and their eyes filled with their hate. She turned and threw herself into the storeroom, slamming the door shut behind her as the first of the creatures hurled itself against it. She leaned back, pressing herself against the door, as if her small weight could hold it shut, then managed to slide the bolt into place. The door shook and trembled under the force of the attack. The center panel split, and a fist came through, reaching and groping for a hold on her. Candy's eyes were screwed shut, but she felt a hand on her shoulder, and she opened her mouth and screamed over and over, feeling the door giving way behind her, feeling it yield as the brood increased the fury of their assault, throwing themselves against it, ripping at the wood as they tried to reach her. Carveth could hear Candy screaming continuously now. Her shouts and the pounding on the door easily carried to the room downstairs. "Nola, they'll kill her." He climbed onto the couch and grabbed her shoulders, shaking her like a doll. "Stop them, Nola. You must make them stop." She looked into his eyes. "It's too late," she said. Carveth stared at her. "You want them to kill her, don't you? You want them to hurt her." His hands moved to her throat. "Nola, for God's sake, I'll kill you if you don't make them stop." Nola screamed. "I won't let you take her!" She began to struggle then, kicking at him, trying to force him away, but he held on to her, pushing down on her, his hands pressing into her neck. From the attic he heard Candy shout, "Daddy, don't let them get me! Don't let them hurt me!" Nola slipped sideways and Carveth tightened his grip. "Nola, please, make them stop!" He held her down, squeezing the life from her. She pulled at his hands, but he increased the pressure. And slowly, as he leaned his full weight upon her, the sounds of the attack upstairs began to subside, then finally ceased altogether.